welcome to episode 167. This is the episode for the hosts to chat, to talk, to reflect on our previous episodes, as well as our own time
Zhao,
in life.
you are getting forgetful. It is 117, not 167.
Oh, okay. 117. I'm trying to make more episodes than it's supposed to be. I told you my brain is not very good. But anyway, welcome. And so we will really go back a little bit about our various episodes about creativity, about the work done in Greece, about the digital divide, as well as the work of Edge Ventures. And let's just start with Punya, since we didn't see you last week.
Thank you. Yeah, and I completely understand this thing of becoming forgetful. I am increasingly finding myself in the same boat, and I am blaming COVID for it as well. So I refuse to say it's age and the normal progression or regression. But yeah, I'm sorry to have missed last week. I was on a flight, so couldn't really be there. So there were a couple of broader things I wanted to talk about, asked to talk about, but let's take the two episodes that really, I think, struck a chord with me in the last four that we had. I think one was sort of the addressing the digital divide, the story of Oakland, and a couple of reasons why I think that episode really stood out to me. One, that at a time when I feel increasingly sort of despondent and sad about the situation in the world, to see a group of people come together in sort of to meet their civic duty, where a variety of different organizations, government, schools, all working together to address this very critical need of this digital divide, which at the start of the pandemic was really, an issue of equity and access, was very inspirational. So I felt that was, I think can be a model, and like Chris often talks about in the article that we wrote, that if one thing Silver Lining for Learning does, it provides examples of sort of good, innovative practices that are emerging. And I felt very good about that episode. And I really applaud that group. And I think in particular, the way they brought sort of the culturally responsive approaches, thinking of the cultural context within which these things function, and recognizing that if not considered and addressed right up front in the design of the system, that would fail. So I think that was really a great episode, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that as well. And I think in parallel to that was the episode, I think that was 2 episodes ago, which was again, I think this sort of related in this sense of this broader issue of culture, which is, I think, often when we talk about educational innovation, we talk about creativity, the conversation often stays at the instrumental level. In creativity in particular has pretty much been limited sort of the cognitive aspects of creativity. There is some mention of social-cultural, but I think the guests that we had there really spoke to the value of that creativity is deeply embedded in cultural contexts, and that if you don't recognize that, you actually lose out a lot. So I felt like those 2 episodes really, among the many amazing episodes we have had, but really do stand out in my mind. And I have another set of that'll take us on a different thread, things that I've been thinking about. So I just want to get what your responses are to those 2 and to the other ones as well. I think that the Greek one was interesting, but I think it stood as a sharp contrast to the other 2, which when I talk about sort of a focus on the technology, a focus on cognition, as opposed to the broader cultural context, I felt that part was missing, which was very richly sort of represented in these 2 other episodes about Oakland and creativity and culture. So yeah, I don't know any thoughts you guys have on that.
Well, thank you, Punya. That was very nice. And thanks, by the way, for really correcting me. I can't believe we are only 117 episodes, and I thought we'd be 160.
Hey, this is the power of positive thinking, man.
I know. If you keep thinking, you can find the parking spot. So, Chris, what do you think?
Well, I like Punya, I feel there's a lot to be depressed about in the world, and I didn't want to have a depressing host reflect episode. So I sat down on my side porch and said, what can I say that's genuinely positive. And what I came up with is, you know how sometimes when political candidates are running and they'll say, are you as well off as you were 4 years ago, and so on. I asked myself, if I am a person who wants to transform education, am I better off today than I was in February 2020? And the answer is absolutely. Absolutely. I am so much better off than I was in February 2020, because this whole hybrid infrastructure that might have taken decades to emerge was forced on people and reached a whole lot of people, as our show has documented, in global South countries. And so now, if you want to talk to somebody in the world that's doing something interesting, even if it's somewhere really remote, there are pathways for doing that. And it's also better in the sense that the huge inequities in the educational system were exposed again, but exposed using a different lens, a fresh lens that kind of brought them back to the forefront. And a whole bunch of creative things happened, and this show is about that would not have happened if we hadn't had the disruption of history and compliance that the pandemic provided. So I really think that people today can say, wow, I've got a set of tools I didn't have before. There's a climate that surrounds education that's at least somewhat more open to thinking outside of the box. And I think that those episodes, so now I have to bring it back, right? I have to bring it back to the question. Those episodes are interesting because I think this show has become sort of something where if there's anything in the world that you would like to do, no matter how wild and crazy it is, you're probably within 2 clicks of somebody who knows all about that on Silver Lining for Learning. So you want to be involved with something that involves creativity, and yes, culture is important, but maybe you're more interested in making creativity wholly accessible across all the dimensions of accessibility. I bet if you contact the people who were guests in that episode, if they didn't say, oh yeah, here's the person to call, they'd say, I'm not sure, but here's the person who would know. So you're 2 clicks away. So if we now don't succeed, it won't be for lack of infrastructure, both human and technical. There are other reasons why we probably won't succeed, but at least those 2 are out of the way. And I'm happy about that. That cheered me up to have that realization.
Thanks, Chris. Well, that is very helpful to have a positive thinking that we are better off changing education than, let's say, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Kurt, what do you think?
Oh, I'll build on Chris. I'll build on Punya. I have a couple of other thoughts. I agree with Chris about the 2 clicks, maybe 3 clicks, but in all those shows, 117 of them, we probably are 2 or 3 clicks away from most people's questions. A guest that we've had in here, or a guest would know someone and be able to recommend someone. We haven't really tapped into the recommendation system, but we have that now with nearly 200 guests in the show over the past 2.5 years. That's a lot of people in all parts of the world. So connections that we now have, but I also want to reflect that connections that we did have brought many of those people in. And in particular, the last couple of weeks for me, having a former student of mine from 1995 come in here, and I went back to the grade book and looked what she got, and it reminded me that was a special class. in that particular class, I combined See You, See Me and Picture Tell to bring in Elliot Soloway, who some of you know from University of Michigan, and a guy named David Palumbo, who Chris knows, whose articles we were reading during the week and critiquing. And my students were, let's just say they weren't mild in their critiques. But when we brought Elliot in, when we brought David in, the same students who were critiquing all their ideas about logo as Latin, being able to shape thinking through programming, and we're agreeing with everything they had to say. And it brought all sorts of ideas of what I was working on a quarter century ago into right away into my head, and think about what am I doing today? How have I changed over the past quarter century? And then so Kim Reed, I sent it to her. I said, remember this? And so the show for me, it brought back all these memories, good memories of what I've played around with pedagogically. And then, of course, to have Richard Garrett, who I also corresponded with and worked on a draft report or a long technical report on the status of e-learning and back in 2002. So the connections are in multiple ways. So one word is connections, and every week there are new connections on this show. Another word that comes to mind is alternatives. In both the Grease show and in the EduVenture show, they were working, and the Oakland show. They were working in jobs with government people in the mayor's office. And I had never thought about the applicability of my, teaching to people who might end up working in the mayor's office or the governor's office or some other, hopefully not Mar-a-Lago, but somewhere down the road. So, the alternative paths that we've been bringing up in this, and I think the Oakland session did a really good job of that. The EduVenture session did a really good job of that, showing the young people the different opportunities that are in front of them today and the possible career paths that they might pick. So that's the second word. The third word and fourth words combined, committed and dedicated. If you go to that Oakland show, you saw a couple of people that are extremely committed and dedicated to what they're doing. And that's definitely the Grease show with 5. Actually, they showed us 3 different virtual worlds. They've built 10, and they actually contacted me to ask how I could help out and be involved there in Greece. I said, no, why don't you come and get involved here through Silver Lining? And I had been on a TV show with them in Japan maybe half year ago, and I right away knew that they were very energetic, very committed, very dedicated. And so that's something we've seen across many shows, is the dedication, commitment, the creativity, and so forth. And then the fourth word is young. A lot of these people, especially the Oakland show, were doing a lot of things at a very young age. And I think they opened up the possibilities for people who might be watching this show as undergraduates. Now we have many undergraduate programs in the field of educational technology, or as graduate students, or as postdocs, or as early career people. If they watch these shows, their minds would expand as to what the possibilities are. I know Dodsy's in the YouTube channel, and he works in the government in Canada, in Ottawa. And then the other word that comes to mind is accomplishments at a young age for many of these people. But, they had many things on display of what they did. And they were very unassuming. They weren't, they don't thrust it in your face. What they've done is really, really exciting, and there's so much more that they'll be able to do over the next 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. That has, like Chris says, that has me optimistic about education. When I hear these people views, very mature in their thinking about what they're able to provide or get involved with, and how courageous many of these people are. I remember we had Kendam on, and Chris used the word courageous when she went off to Indonesia and Nepal and some pretty scary situations, where tribal rituals of still cutting people's hands off, and she had to put new prosthetic hands on people while she was doing her studies. So courageous, a lot of accomplishments, young, committed, dedicated. That's what I see in these shows.
Well,
I'll
thank you,
stop.
Kurt. You've set up a very high bar for us. Summarizing words, this English is my second language. I can't catch up to that, but several things I think I noticed. One is that the idea that people can do anything if you want. I really think that is actually true. If from all our shows, our episodes, if you are dedicated, if you want to do something, the technology has made it possible. I think we always underestimate the power of technology. Randy, when about 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I wrote about this, when the audience become the broadcaster, it actually meant something. When the reader becomes the writer, that actually meant something. But however, I don't think our schools are taking advantage of that, are helping our children to develop the desire, the passion, and the dedication to do what Kurt, you were talking about, young and accomplished. You can. However, I don't think our school are helping our children to become such. I think we're just talking about our children just now before the show. You look at our children, how many of them are genuinely actively dedicating themselves to creating possibilities for others, creating impact online. I think that's one of the things. You look at Oakland is definitely doing that. It was almost impossible to bring people from Greece, let's say 15, 20 years ago to do this. So what we've done is truly amazing. I think the second thing I noticed is what Chris talked about. But ideas pass around and cross borders really fast. And we see, if you look at all our episodes, I mean, there's people from different places, but we are almost talking about common language, about education. They really traverse fast. And so that is another thing I think we fail to capture. If you look at our scores, our classes, we still do textbook, we still do standardized testing. Why do we need to do that? If we still have teachers control student learning, all of those things. But ideas are there and they travel and they're accessible. But also at the same time, you say how many people are not accessing. So getting the idea of habit of accessing those things, I think is another thing that we need to rethink about. A third thing I think is the racial and ethnic reckoning right now in this country and in other places. That's how we had access to the creativity people from Wisconsin, from Ohio. It is the awareness outside certain cultural groups. I mean, we do have education systems that tends to be racist. There are many different aspects, perspectives that's not been promoted. So when Ron Beghetto and we co-edited that issue of the research, a review of research in education, the RRE, we deliberately solicited different views on creativity. And by the way, Ron and I were just starting editing another issue. I hope you guys will submit. This one is specifically on side effects in education. It's really from my work called What Works May Hurt, specifically soliciting articles and submissions about the side effects of education. Because in education, we've been talking too much about evidence of what works, but not evidence of what it might hurt or damages, the side effects of education. I hope you guys will submit something. So those are really the main points that really hit me. The important thing I really want to emphasize is that today, there are many more possibilities than our youth have been taught or educated to explore. And so that is, I think, a very significant issue. Another thing is that I just want to say, in this world, it is very important to do things. If you did something, people will know. So that's something, but if you didn't do anything, you just complain, it won't work. So that's really how I view where we are. And I want to get back to Chris, see if you have any follow-up and you were commenting on anything.
Well, the other thought that I had about being positive is you may remember that I don't know the episode number, but we had Rick Ferdig and some of his colleagues from the SITE, the Society for Information Technology and Teacher Education, and they have this journal, the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education, and they publish it themselves. So it's completely open access, and we had them because they had this special issue on what teacher educators should have learned from the pandemic, which of course is a wonderful question. And I participated in a second special issue that they had called Teacher Education 2025 that just came out. So I put it on LinkedIn, and in less than a week, it got almost 8,000 views. Now, why did it get that many views? It wasn't, let me say quickly, because I think I had an article in it. In fact, I didn't put the LinkedIn link to my article. I put the LinkedIn link to the journal's table of contents. And I'm sure there were some people who followed that who said, oh no, not another article by Didi. But then they looked farther down and they said, wow, look at this thing. I'm going to click on it and see what comes back. So that says to me that there is a hunger out there that the scholarly journals, the best in the world journals, aren't even touching for big ideas and practical ideas about reshaping education. And that hunger is being satisfied by people like Rick and his colleagues that are putting something out where if you like an article, you don't have to go find a way to sign into your institutional library and spend 15 minutes navigating so that you can get a PDF without paying $50 for it. That you just click and there it is. And it's a theme issue. So if you like one of the articles, you're probably going to like some of the other ones. And I just was heartened. I was really heartened to see how fast that drew views. And I'd love to see their analytics on that. But we need more professional associations that are doing something like that. And we need more people saying, this goes back to what we talked about. It might have been last week or the week before, or maybe it was just a side conversation we had. This sort of best in the world stuff where unless you publish in these 5 elite journals that only other elite professors ever publish in or read, you're not making a difference. Well, no. The impact factor of those journals is whether or not you get cited. But the real impact factor is 8,000 views on LinkedIn by people who are out in the world making a difference, who are looking at that work and saying, some of these ideas, I think I'm going to run with them. And I wish we measured that because, we could now. We could measure memes and how memes propagate through society. And I'm willing to bet a lot of money that they do not propagate through the broader society in the high impact scholarly journals. They propagate through society through Silver Lining for Learning, through things like the Journal of Technology and Teacher Education, through op-eds like we write, and of course through Kurt traveling everywhere that has an airport. So, lots of different opportunities there. So that was the second thing that cheered me up. I said to myself,
Chris,
we're developing a whole meme system that's independent of academic glamour, but that is in fact starting to work.
Thanks, Chris. Many years ago, I don't know, Punya, if you remember, when we were at Michigan State University, we're talking a lot of open journals in the 1996, 1990s, at that time when the web just were popping up. But right now, I think there are a lot of publishing companies. They really don't do much, but they published these journals. These journals were actually, edited by scholars, and written by scholars, but they're published. So I don't really even get that, but so that's one of the things that there's a system, somehow enterprises, they make a lot of money, they make it very expensive to subscribe, So that is something I think, a great point to be challenged. Kurt, you have something, you one more point to add before we go to Punya?
Go ahead, Punya, and then I'll jump in after.
Yeah, no, I was just following up on that journal thing. I mean, and what's funny is you started having these open journals, and then now all these journals have their open access, but you have to pay an arm and a leg to print in it. I mean, the number of requests I get from faculty in my college who would like to publish there, but it costs $1,000 or whatever to publish for what is effectively a website.
$1,000 is less. Actually, it's more expensive. I've always rejected this. I'm not going to pay that money to do it. Yeah.
It's crazy.
So I will come back to that point about journals in just a second. But first, I want to counter a little bit what Punya had to say about the Greek show. If you're going back and watching the show on Greece, they actually are contextualizing those creations, the VR and AR that they're doing. They had actually mentioned the two young girls that got killed by the volcano, and that led to that first simulation they built on emergency preparedness for schools. So they contextualized that within the cultural historical setting in Athens. That was in Athens. They're not in Athens, that university, but I would guess that if we were to ask them what was the background information that led to each one of those VR simulations that they created, there would probably be some cultural relevance. Probably, I'm not positive, but at least the first one does. And I'm guessing several others do as well. So if anyone, do watch that show too.
Hold on.
Yeah,
I want to respond to that.
Go ahead.
I think that this is a very interesting point of contention. Then I can jump in with my point. Punya, go ahead. You get a chance to rebuttal.
Sure. Well, I think the point I'm trying to make, I think is big, and then this sort of, maybe I can transition to this other issue that I wanted us to talk about today, or wanted to hear your opinions on. I think that, yes, everything that we do is grounded in some kind of a context, right? It's the question is how that whole discussion is framed. And I think that if you look at the conversation that we had with Oakland, the conversation that we had with the scholars on creativity who were talking about Latinx and Hispanic and African-American narratives and stories, there was a foregrounding of the cultural aspect. While if you think of the discussion on the Greek one, the foregrounding was the technology. It is not about which is better or worse, and I'm sorry if it came across that way, but I am increasingly of the sort of understanding or thinking that there are these broader cultural issues that in education we have not necessarily given the kind of attention that it deserves to get. And so again, so now we have talked a little bit, Zhao, you talked a little bit, and Chris, about what technology can let us do. And this has been something I've actually been thinking a lot about for the last week or 10 days, wrote a whole series of blog posts about it because I just got fired up in my head. And it sort of emerged from a conversation that Ezra Klein had on his podcast with one of his former colleagues from Vox, who have just written a book about technology and democracy. And in that, they went back to some of the earlier scholars of technology. So Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman, and that sort of made me go back and sort of rethink and revisit some of that work. And it sort of struck me that one of the things that in EdTech we really haven't given much attention to is the propensities that some of these technologies have to guide our thinking and guide the overall sort of working of society in certain ways. So, when we go from an oral to a print culture, print is static, you can look it up. And so the nature of knowledge also starts gaining those attributes, right? And now when we move into a world where is dominated by discourses on social media, the importance of status of somebody liking or not liking and the whole thing becoming sort of gamified becomes more significant. And I think that those forces in some way are in some ways more powerful than some of like our efforts at tweaking one aspect of education or whatever. So again, not saying that we shouldn't be working in that space, that that's not worthy. But I think that we need, as people who work in the field of education and technology, a better philosophy of technology. And I think that we haven't sort of developed that. And there is, want to make a plug for a short story by one of my favorite science fiction writers, Ted Chiang. And he has this amazing short story called The Truth of Fact and the Truth of Feeling, in which he has two parallel stories, one based in the past in an African nation where print is being discovered for the first time because of European colonialism. And the second is placed slightly in the future, where we live in a world where every moment of our lives can be recorded and then rewound and replayed. And what kinds of implication that has about how we think about what is fact, what is feeling, how humans respond to that, a phenomenal story. But I think that that's been something that I've been thinking a lot about the last few days, because I look at sort of the broader political and geopolitical culture that we are living in. And I wonder whether in education, we have been sort of working so much in a corner that we haven't seen that shift or recognized how that has transformed in ways, some good, the fact that, we can share our knowledge easily, but in many ways also quite harmful and detrimental to the spread of knowledge, to, education.
Well, I need to add something here. This is something quite interesting. So actually, it's going back to the Greek episode about AR, VR. Kurt was saying, my perspective, has to do with the question I raised. It's basically education technology. We've been always praising people who can create stuff. We've been getting money. We created websites. We created hypercards. Remember, we created a lot of things. We created many things and to do. But, my perspective is how fast can they reach a classroom? Another thing is that we always created things to serve what we must teach. That's another thing, I think, we basically serve the curriculum that we want to teach this, then we gamify it, we do whatever we like with it. But while children are moving away from really that, so children practically could have a different life at this time. So how do we capture all of those? You look at, the little learning modules or little learning software apps. God, there are probably millions of them. If you go there, schools buy them, kids download them. So how do we get to that? I think that it's easy, it's exciting to get that. But another point, I think I just want to bring this to all our thinking is that at this moment, our children are on TikTok. Our children are Instagram. Our children are in all the social media or tiny video show, all those kind of things. I'm sure there are educators who have occupied certain channels, certain places. There are people trying to educate in different ways, how to cook and how to garden, all those kind of things. So I was wondering if our states could rethink about curriculum standards or about true learning. Because right now, standardized testing and learning is still very much confined and controlled to a very small amount of, we call skills and knowledge. So that is really another thing. I think, can technology push that change? Is that possible? Because that's still what the education system used to credential people. Kurt and Chris, guys want to jump in?
Kurt, go for it.
Actually, I had part two of my other, I don't have an answer to that. I want to talk about the journals that I'm editing, since you both brought up ones that you're doing. And I want to make a couple points about it. I did ETRD, Ed Tech Research and Development, 2 years ago, a special issue with Vanessa Dennett at Florida State, my former student, and Florence Martin, now at UNC, or no, moved from UNC Charlotte to North Carolina State. The three of us worked on a special issue on emerging technologies a systemic review of emerging learning technologies and learning environments. And we tried to get in Springer to turn that into a book. And AECT was willing to turn it into a book at a very cheap price. But Springer charges literally, like 180 euros to buy the issue. It's like over $200. You weren't willing to do that. But they were willing to make what we did is put bookends on it, the opening and ending. We had them and pushed them to make it free. So David Wiley and I, who's been on the show, wrote an intro summarizing the last 30 years of educational emerging technologies since the 1990s, or even before in the 1980s, and especially getting to openness, which David's very much a leader in. And then Tom Reeves and Linlin at North Texas wrote a piece about, for the ending, wrote a piece about, it's not just about technology and researching the latest and greatest, but it's solving problems. And we picked up on that theme too. So we were able to make the theme of the whole issue open and free access to the world. And those are the most downloaded, naturally, of the whole issue, other than the piece on learning analytics. But yeah, so that issue is done well, but the problem is, as you say, it's behind a firewall, most of it. Some of the pieces are available for free. We push to get that happen. So we're doing a follow-up right now for Online Learning Journal, which is all open access and free from the Online Learning Consortium. We're doing an issue, another systematic review of the research on online learning, various topics and so forth. We're in the midst of that. It'll come out in the spring of 2023. We're just about, actually close to being done. I don't know why we have to wait for it. That's another thing, is the time lag in all of these. But that is automatically open access. So we're hopeful there. And Vanessa and I will do a third one with the Internet and Higher Ed Journal that she's the editor of, on faculty development online during the next year. So all of us are involved in many of these special issues. And that is one way to make an impact on the field, to find a topic that has been little discussed or needs some additional work or needs a recap or a summary of some kind. I see Chris leaning forward, so I assume he wants to jump in on this.
Well, I want to jump in, but I actually want to go back to Punya and Marshall McLuhan, because I collected a lot of Marshall McLuhan's work when I was a graduate student and kept it on my bookshelves, and found him to be a very influential thinker. And this is maybe too arcane for much of our audience, but I remember the big debate between Rich Mayur and Bob Cosma about, does the medium affect the message or not? And of course it does. But, I don't think either side in the debate expressed their point of view particularly well. So we know that the medium does shape the message. TikTok shapes the message, Zoom shapes the message, etc. And we know that something that McLuhan didn't think about as much, which is that the context shapes the interaction. And so when people walk into a room, they should be saying, what is this room empowering and what is it disempowering? And if it's a virtual room, they should be saying the same thing. And culture, right? Culture shapes the interaction. So understanding different cultures is really important, because then you're understanding the invisible walls that surround all of us. But I think when people talk about media literacy, they think of it as in a very weak way. And I would like to see people learn to see the world through the eyes of Marshall McLuhan if he'd taken his doctorate in anthropology. So he really understood culture, context, and the things that he understood. We really need to think about the world that way. And I'll without being partisan, I'm going to recount a news story that I saw yesterday, or maybe I read about it. So federal agents went into Mar-a-Lago. They carried out some stuff, and the former president said, well, maybe they brought all that in. Maybe they just smuggled it in, and then they discovered it and they took it out again. And so this stuff was planted on me. And then one of his lawyers says, well, that isn't possible because Trump was actually watching everything they were doing on CCTV from New York. And of course, now that's with all the cameras everywhere, the idea that anybody can do anything without being watched is crazy. So one moral to that story is, how many Pinocchios can a single human being acquire? But another moral to that story is, the reporters should have been thinking about media. And the reporters, the minute he said that, they should have said, well, Mr. President, weren't you watching that? And then he would have been in a bind. So I just think we need more of what you were saying, Punya. We really need to think about the invisible and pervasive influence of culture, context, and medium on what's going on in the world. Because if we educate people to understand that, then they are empowered by it rather than misled by it.
So I'll jump in here, Chris and Punya. I came to IU 30 years ago exactly this month, and we have a demonstration site. Our building is a demonstration site for technology and education. It was built with some pork, literally. But when I got there, I got to the instructional systems technology department. I was in ed psych, but I walked over to instructional systems technology and I looked inside their classroom, and all fancy, nice chairs, except for one old wooden chair. And I said, why is this old wooden chair there? They said, well, that's the chair Marshall Mcluhan sat in. We saved that one from the old building. So if you guys, so Chris, in your roundup of all these, you could come by Indiana sometime and sit in the chair that Marshall Mcluhan sat in, just so you know.
That's funny. That's good.
So Punya, were you going to ask the question of Dazis?
Yeah, I can ask that question. But I want to just follow up quickly on something Chris said that sparked a thought in my mind. And, Chris, you mentioned this idea that people talk about media literacy. And I remember having this conversation many years ago with an unnamed scholar who was developing a model for literacy on the web. And this was somebody's student's dissertation. And I remember asking this question because one of the things that you do for traditional print literacy is who wrote it, right? What was their agenda? And when you come to collaborative writing systems such as Wikipedia, that's a question that goes out the window in some way, because it is a shared collaborative writing space, which could be anonymous, which could be whatever. And so, but they had not even considered that. And so they were taking models of existing literacy and trying to apply it to a medium, which it didn't really apply. The kinds of questions you would ask would be different. So I think what I'm hearing you say and what I increasingly feel about is that, yes, our kids are on TikTok, we are on some form of media, whether it's LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever it may be. I think a big part of the media literacy needs to be about those hidden assumptions and constraints and guardrails or forms of incentives that these media have. So this is sort of a segue to Dodsey's questions, where his question was, what is sort of expected change in higher education? I think one of the things that we have talked about, we are all sitting in R1 institutions where research, producing new knowledge is a critical part of it, but there are these institutional and social and economic barriers to the free sharing of that information. So I think one of the big pieces is going to be that. There was a recent news just a couple of days ago of the best sort of inorganic chemistry textbook or organic chemistry, I don't remember exactly which one, but a chemistry textbook, which is one of the best sellers in the field. The professor there decided to make that book completely open access. And I've often argued that, for instance, as a college of education where we talk about equity and issues that way, why can't a college make a statement saying in the next 2 years, all of our textbooks for our classes are going to be open access? But if they exist out there in the world, fine. If they don't, we will write them.
But the empire strikes back. So Pearson is thinking about making its textbooks NFTs so that you cannot sell it without Pearson getting a cut. They know exactly where it is. So it's always a double-edged sword, right? It's always a double-edged sword.
But I think that the bigger point here is that we do need a deeper sort of discussion. I'm not saying you will come up with an absolute answer that's going to whatever, right? But at least an understanding that the way media is structured because of culture, because of economics. I mean, Zhao, we have talked about, you've talked about, sort of the surveillance state in China, where, we talk about the pandemic causing positive opportunities for education. It is also allowed for a level of surveillance of individuals under the label of safety. We are seeing the same thing in schools, where software and laptops, which were used to monitor students and so on, the pandemic is gone. Guess what? Those data collection surveillance tools have not gone away. So I think there are lots of issues here that we need to be thinking and talking about. And given the pervasiveness of the media and how early we are getting into it, that the earlier we have the discussion with children, the earlier that becomes a part of how we think about these things, the better, the more important, I think, the better it is going to be.
So the question does raises what will happen to higher education. And you guys are talking about media literacy. I want Rain to raise a bigger question. Can we actually not demand reading as a universal skill? Remember, reading becomes necessary for everybody is because of modern schooling and Gutenberg, right? But if without Gutenberg, without that technology, we probably don't need everybody to read. So are we at the point that if you can access information on TikTok, on audio, audio, a lot of people are listening to books now, so if we are not relying on reading, what would happen? And also when we increase demand, let's say, for example, media literacy, it needs to be carefully studied. But now reading occupies a lot of the time. We never devote as much time to media literacy at all as to, we call traditional reading literacy. So that is really an interesting question for our audience to think about. Do we actually need to force everybody to read? Reading has become such a big deal, and we torture our kids over it. Really, we torture. Of course, I can read. I've been, by the way, labeled by people who say Yong Zhao is against reading. I'm not really against reading. I just want to raise the question: is it possible for us to consider a transition? Is it possible for us to rethink when we add learning of all these new things? Do we have to cut something out? So that was just what Punya, Chris.
No, I mean, I think Zhao, I think the point you're making is, and I think what I would follow up to that one is that it's not up to us as educators, because you're absolutely right. The whole schooling is around the idea of the book, right? And that is, and what I've been thinking of is this over the past week, 10 days, is this thing, right? Which is that if the book is the center of what schooling is, while the world around us is changing. So the question is not whether schools are changing or not. The fact of the matter is, I mean, for me, Google is the way if I have a question about something, I'm going to go Google it. Turns out, I was just reading the study recently that for a certain generation of people, younger mostly, TikTok is how they find their information, which seems so bizarre to me. But again, I'm sure I feel bizarre to them. And I think that this is interesting,
So let me jump quickly in on this, and then Kurt, I think you should ask your question. I've been fascinated by and for some time studying transmedia narratives. And there is a very interesting literature on this. So take Harry Potter. There's the book, there's the movie, there's the theme park, there's the graphic novel, there's the fan fiction website, there's the game, right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Transmedia narratives. Each medium shapes what it processes. And at the center of this is some kind of thing that's beyond all the media, that's the heart of the Harry Potter stuff. And so what I would say is anybody who doesn't experience something in all of the media that are portraying it is missing something. And that isn't an argument for making reading central, but it is an argument for keeping reading around.
Excellent point. And I just want to hold this book up for Dodsey. This is one of my favorite books. It's called The Medium is the Massage, Not Message, by Marshall Mcluhan and Quentin Fiore. And it's one of the best designed books I've ever seen. It's a tiny little paperback, but each page has a unique design. And given my love of typography and images and all that, this is like always sitting right here next to me for inspiration. So, and Dodsey and I were chatting out in the back, so I thought I'd just share that. Kurt, your question.
Yeah, I have a question for you guys. You know, this show across all 116, 17, 157 episodes that we've had, it's really about new models of education or rethinking old models. And in some part, it's about designing new learning environments. I'm going to teach a course starting in a week about designing learning environments. I want to get your three perspectives on, and this could help our audience kind of make sense of what we've been doing for the past 2.5 years. What is something I should include in that class where authors, old ones, new ones, or how could I incorporate Silver Lining for Learning videos in that class on designing learning environments? What do you recommend I put in it? I'm going to be working on it tomorrow. I need your help. I've never taught this before. And how could I incorporate Silver Lining in this? Any thoughts? Any suggestions?
Kurt, before I answer a question, I have to emphasize Punya's question, Punya's answer. School is about reading books. You know, the Chinese original version, you know, we call educated person 读书人, the one who reads the book. So 读书人. So when we say, are you going to school? We'll say, have you started reading books? So everything is written about the book. Another thing was really, when Chris was jumping in to say, you know, it is shocking why university undergraduates have to pay so much for undergraduate textbook. That was, I mean, just, you know, people can write them and people can watch YouTube of them. People can do, but I mean, just really, that's just unbelievable. We would make kids pay 100, 150, 200 bucks per textbook. Why do you need even a textbook? So that is really quite interesting. But Kurt, I have to pretend to give you an answer, you know. So you know, I don't know how do you design learning environments, because I don't think you do design learning environments. You design based on the students. I think students should always be part of the designer of whatever environments you design. Anyway, that was my answer to that.
Well, that's kind of my answer. I'm going to have the students design a second syllabus that might replace whatever I design. So that's part of the answer. Thank you for that. You confirmed that. Chris,
by the way,
or
Kurt, actually, there's one thing I do with my students now. I always give them the syllabus, the articles, and I tell them they're about 1/3 I have to teach. Another third, you can discuss and debate what you would like to do. Another third will be designed for yourself. So you can choose, you know, 3 parts of the curriculum, you know. Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I've for a long time been fascinated by immersion and the spectrum of immersion from augmented reality through virtual reality. Jeremy Bailenson book, Experience on Demand. I never assign textbooks, but I assign that book. And there's a more recent book by David Rose, who's a guy at MIT, called Supersight. That's AR. It's the equivalent of that for AR. Either one of those, or a chapter from either one of those, or both of those, I think would be cool to use.
Jeremy Bailenson, can you spell it? You're muted, Chris, but Punya, you have some thoughts?
No, I was just looking up the books that Chris suggested. No, I think that I've really enjoyed this conversation, honestly. And I want to second what Chris said, which is that there is going to be a place for print as there is going to be a place for other media and other emergent media as well. I have been, there's this software called DALL-E Mini, which is this AI software where you can just type in words and it will create images for you. And you have to sign up for an account. And I signed up like 2 months ago. Finally, I got it last week. And it raises such interesting questions about issues of authorship. So I was invited to be in this conversation with this science fiction writer who had written this story about, coming to Dodsey's question about the future of the university. And so we had this discussion. And then in the meanwhile, I got access to that AI software. And so I was taking themes from the short story and entering it into that software with some tweaks from my side. And it would create these elaborately amazing images. And you can say in the pointillist style or in Picasso style, or you can say photorealistic. So I could say Kurt Bonk floating in space, eating a hamburger, which is green in color. And this software will create that for you. It's crazy. But the question of authorship that started coming up in my mind, who made those images? Was it Phoebe Wagner, the author of the short story, who gave the themes, or me, who abstracted some stuff from there, or the people who, created that software? It's really, really interesting. And I've started looking at some of these GPT-3 models that are coming out, writing.
Yes, I just put one of those into the chat.
Yeah, we should
Glenn
get
Kleiman,
somebody to one of our
who
guests.
some of you may
on
know,
this.
Glenn Kleiman.
Yes, I know.
Just published an article in the Stanford Graduate School of Education, whatever it is, newsletter,
and
where he
the
co-authored
images-
it with GPT-3. So now who is the author? That's really interesting, I think.
So there is a scientific paper out there. They haven't mentioned which journal they've submitted it to, but it's completely written by AI. It's under review right now. There was an article in the Scientific American.
Did the AI do the scientific experiment, the discovery?
I don't know the details of it. Look it up in Scientific American. I think it was in Scientific American.
Well,
But it is under
issue a
peer review right
challenge.
now.
I'll
Say that
issue a
again, Chris.
challenge. I'll run rings around any AI on any education related topic that anybody cares to name.
Yeah. So I actually use some of these just to test it out. So I would take I would use the free version of it. So which limited the number of characters. So I'd give it some passage and say, make an abstract. It wrote a pretty phenomenal abstract. Or I would say, rewrite it for 5th grade level, rewrite it for 10th grade level. It would rewrite my prose and grammatically correct and awesome.
That's not writing, that's paraphrasing.
No, I know, but I also did that where I said, write an article on X. I gave it the TPAC framework to write an article on, and it wrote one. Was not fantastic, but I would say a freshman level of understanding of the topic.
Well, that's what, the translation has become so good. So
Yeah.
I think this is a very interesting area. Maybe we will invite a AI co-host next year to join us.
We should have a show on chatbots and AI, a couple of shows, actually. We should have maybe 2 or 3 in a row. It might be a thematic issue in 1 month.
Someone
Chris,
could put a
you want to
chat bot
introduce the
into
next
the YouTube
episode?
channel.
I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
So I should pitch next week's show because we're almost out of time. And coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, next week's show is on Sesame Street. And if we want a story about how something has become a transmedia narrative and at scale has changed the education of young people, Sesame Street is a wonderful example. My colleague Joe Blatt, who was part of the inception, is bringing in a couple folks from Sesame Street now to talk about not only the history, but some of their newest efforts, such as reaching out to refugees. So exciting show. We'll apply the lens of Mcluhan and others, and we hope that you'll join us next week.